The acting councilwoman's eyes narrowed a bit as she stared down at the screen in front of her. A few moments later, Matriarch Magisteria Avalogatha Tua released a deep sigh before using one end of her trunk to swipe away at the screen, dismissing the progress report she had just received from her homeworld. With a twist of her long neck, she turned her head around to look to the other end of the room, where her sister was busy with her own, though likely very similar, affairs. It had been some time since they had met face to face, and so Magisteria really did not want to seek any conflict now that they finally had a chance to. Still, she couldn't quite help a bit of uneasy frustration bubbling up within her.
"I really do hope you know what you are doing, Apoginorana," she finally said, while rubbing over her face with the split ends of her trunk. "I understand that you have some kind of idea behind this, but these payments of reparations are no small thing, even for us. Not to mention that our entire fleets are being grounded, while all of our officers are under investigation. The questions about our order guards are becoming louder and louder as well."
She released an irritated trumping sound, while her ears began to flap a bit faster in order to fan some cool wind at her face.
"And to top it off, that Deathworlder actually seems to be looking to take his seat among us,"
she continued her diatribe, as she leaned her head down a bit, using one of her down-pointing tusks to briefly scratch a low part of her leg. Ultimately, she sighed once again.
"I have never known a High Matriarch to be this much of a gambler."
Apoginorana had listened to her sister patiently, and finally released a gentle giggle once she was finished with her tirade.
"Primate, dear sister,"
she simply chided her very gently in return.
"He is a primate. Do not forget that."
Magisteria shook her head slightly, but couldn't help but scoff out a single laugh.
"He is both," she reminded her sister, "and he has picked his side. Also, they did not answer my concerns in the slightest."
Apoginorana trumpeted in amusement as she gently swapped from one window on her screen to a different one.
"Maybe he did," she said, "but his people have yet to make their final choice, so let us not treat them as the enemy while that is yet to be decided."
Magisteria released a low breath.
"Sometimes I would love to share your optimism,"
she commented under her breath, causing another bout of amusement for her sister.
"Not optimism, my dear," she corrected. "Faith."
She finally lifted her gaze away from the screen to look at Magisteria, her head held ever so slightly higher than that of the lower-ranking matriarch.
"I believe the will has not led us astray, and I am by no means alone in that assumption," she said, her voice carrying nothing but confidence. "You say I'm a gambler, but you know that when the will extends a possibility, you mustn't ever hesitate."
Magisteria huffed and briefly threw her trunk into the air to release some energy that could otherwise have been spent on less fortunate expressions of her frustration.
"Careful, it will chew you up and spit you out if you misread its signs," she cautioned her sister, to which Apoginorana even nodded in approval. "Correct," she said, "but certain signs are hard to miss."
Magisteria grimaced slightly at that ominous statement, though she wasn't even going to try and get whatever that was supposed to mean out of her older sibling. At least she could assure herself that if she was this confident, there had to be a reason for it.
"Come now, let's not fight."
Apoginorana then suddenly spoke up again, putting her out of her brief moment of thought.
"How about we talk about something more interesting instead? After all, it seems like the bushel of candidates for the next Dural Friend has thinned out quite a bit since the grand gesture of one of the competitors has become public. Do you have a favourite among the Nafmir, dear sister? After all, I understand that your relationship with the previous one had grown a bit strained in places."
Magisteria released a long breath through her trunk, not entirely sure how happy she was about the change of topic from her sister, but she also knew she wasn't going to get anything more substantial out of her without actually escalating things. Taking the breath she had just released back in sharply, she thought for a moment. Yes, indeed. She confirmed her sister's words to buy herself a bit of time to think, without allowing the silence to become awkward. I can't say I'm all too desperate for the next one to be chosen quickly. She then slowly began to elaborate, while an answer slowly formed within her mind. But I guess if you make me pick one, the young Moroccoles would be my choice. As she looked over, she saw an amused twinkle flash in her sister's eyes, as Apoginorana raised her trunk a bit to point at her.
Oh my, I never knew you had developed an appetite for young shoots during your absence.
Her sister then teased her, the sickly sweet tone of her voice sending shudders down Magisteria's back, especially considering the subject matter.
I guess I can't fault you for indulging after everything.
Magisteria quickly swiped her trunk at the air, almost like she wanted to swat the very topic to the ground.
Don't be ridiculous, she said,
without a hint of humour in her voice, puffing a burst of air from her trunk.
I'm simply thinking of Agifianora,
she then stated categorically, and pressed both halves of her trunk closely together.
Assuming things proceed as they should, she will be spending a far larger part of her life with this next dual friend than either of us will have to. It was one thing while it was her father who held the name, but now that he is gone, and thus her situation has changed, I would not like to burden her with the same situation we were stuck with in our youth. We had our time. We should think of the next generation while the name is passed down.
Apoginorana fell quiet for a moment, her head slightly swaying.
I see, she then mumbled. But even if that is the case, do you agree with your daughter that he is fit to carry the name?
Magisteria slightly grit her teeth. I don't like to question her judgment on the matter, considering the alternative, she replied, entirely earnest. When it comes down to it, anyone can grow into the name, and he certainly seems to hold her good will, much unlike any of the other Nafmir from what I've seen. Things got quiet between them for a long moment, their many eyes staring past each other instead of holding contact, as their trunks and ears gently waved through the air. I take it you have a different preference? Magisteria then finally assumed with a sigh.
I can't deny that,
Apoginorana confirmed.
Maybe it's because I'm not a mother like you are, but I guess I am not quite as ready to think about my retirement yet.
As the ramp of his shuttle lowered slowly, gradually revealing the view of what lay behind it inch by inch, James took one last deep breath and closed his eyes for exactly 10 heartbeats. He counted them down in his head, focusing on the sound and feeling of each of the pressing pumps from the muscle in his chest, before finally letting the breath out just as slowly. With a snap, his eyes shot open, and the corners of his mouth lifted into a smirk as his gaze fell upon the by now half-revealed view of the station that awaited him, along with hints of the associated crowd. Around him, his ears could pick up on all kinds of noises. The impatient scratching of claws on metal, the subtle grinding of scales against each other, the nervous clacking of a beak, a tail quietly swishing through the air. However, he himself showed no signs of such nervousness, showed being the operating word. There were 1,000 thoughts flying through his head right now, many of which very much wanted to express themselves outwardly, in one way or another. However, if there was ever one time, if there had ever been one moment in which he would have to look confident, in which it had to seem like he was ready for this, which one could have been better than right now? Noises from the crowds outside flooded into the shuttle's inlets, greeting the arrivals with a full spectrum of emotion and expectation that was awaiting them here. It was unclear if the leak came from the same people who had previously messed with their communications, or if it was a simple matter of some of the locally employed people not being able to keep their mouths shut. But no matter what the source may have been, fact was that the news that James had been extended, and ultimately accepted, the invitation of the Galactic Council was just about the worst-kept secret in the entire galaxy. Unsurprisingly, that meant that far more than just a few curious onlookers had made their way to the publicly accessible parts of the Council station in order to witness the historic moment of the first ever Deathworlder councilman, even if it was just an acting one, stepping foot onto his new home away from home for the very first time. They all, of course, had their own thoughts and feelings on the matter that could not have been more different from each other in some cases, but that really didn't take away from the plain and simple fact that they did not want to miss it, especially the many gathered news crews who were quite obviously hoping to gain themselves a front row seat to the many announcements and conferences that would naturally have to follow his inauguration, temporary as it may be. However, for however many people had managed to set aside the necessary time and money to drop everything and immediately make their way to this place in order to get here in a timely manner for James's arrival, their large seas of bodies were still kept in check by the enormous black swarms of human troops, which were moving almost robotic in their coordination. With the full might of 3 near fully staffed warships accompanying him, it would have taken a literal army of people flooding this still comparably small station in order to rival them in force, and the UHSDF was very clearly not planning to leave anything up to chance this time, not after everything that had happened. Before James had even been cleared to get the idea of stepping into the shuttle, multiple regiments of soldiers were already sent over to the station in order to clear the area for him. They may still not have fully understood the strange, shield-like weaponry that had been previously employed against them, but with the samples they had managed to secure from the battlefield and destroyed complex, they at least knew what they were looking for now, and they did not intend to allow for a repeat of the previous events. Even now, as the last few seconds passed before he could officially step onto the station himself, James could see the hard border formed by the fine people of the 489th Planetside Regiment, which had descended from the A Place in the Sun to keep order and safety as he arrived. In all honesty, one could have mistaken it for an invasion, and James was sure that plenty of possible reporters and journalists were going to portray the story that way in the later news. But the actions of the UHSDF had been fully announced and were met with nothing but very minimal pushback in the time leading up to his arrival. Despite the well-known fact that James was far from the most popular person among many people within the council, it very much seemed like none of them wanted to take chances with the possibility of him being attacked on their very own station. Quite possibly, this was also aided by his reputation as Grim Reaper, that literally saw people all around him suffer the far worse fate whenever someone was actually trying to touch him. It was an amusing idea that the more superstitious among the council may have put extra effort into protecting him to keep themselves from suffering the ripple effects that any attack on him might have cast over the station. Finally, the gentle clank of the shuttle's ramp hitting the ground reached his ear, indicating that it was go time. Not needing to worry about any protection walking ahead of him this time, James immediately began to step out of the shuttle as soon as the ramp had reached its full stop. His gait firm and energetic, as his boots impacted the metal ground firm enough to be heard. As soon as he had left the confines of the shuttle behind, he followed the script that he had by now long established for himself, ripping his left arm high into the air with the back of his forearm presented to the world. Although the scars on it were covered by his sleeve at the moment, everybody watching knew what lay underneath as he confidently moved forward, more fists soon raising around him, and a copy of his gesture as all who shared his mark raised it with him, though they were now also joined by many who didn't have the same matching scar or tattoo on their own body, yet wished to express their solidarity anyway. An immediate rumbling of entirely unrestrained volume went through the crowd, as gazes snapped onto them from all around. Cameras flashed, fingers clacked on screens as notes were hastily taken, and words were mumbled into microphones as many among the crowd did their best to capture the moment in some way, shape or form. Meanwhile, many others simply stood and stared, taking it in as the Deathworlder councilmen walked out onto the station with their entirely own thoughts and feelings on the matter. Thoughts and feelings which some of them chose to loudly express to the world, while others instead decided to quietly keep to themselves. By now, James had grown used to the mixture of cheering and jeering that followed him wherever he went, and so he wasn't disheartened by the many negative and often hurtful words that were thrown at him over the heads of the protecting soldiers, as he stepped more and more into the open to face the masses and approach his ultimate destination. In fact, there was even a little hint of positive surprise within him, as he heard just how much the chires and insults had to compete with more well-meant expressions of welcome and support. Those were still very clearly in the minority. However, in this place, that was expectedly filled in a large majority with people originating from the close by and surrounding core worlds. he did not take it for granted that positivity offered any sort of noticeable pushback against the wave of opposition, and sometimes outright hatred that had obviously awaited him. A sign of how much those parts of the galaxy had actually respected Athena's judgment, he suspected. Although it was odd and even felt hypocritical of him to think, after everything he himself had said to the man, James suddenly found himself feeling a not-so-subtle hope that he wouldn't be disappointing what the man had seen in him, even if only retroactively so. Allowing his fist to sink down again, after he felt like he would have ventured into self-indulgent territories to keep it up any longer, James briefly flexed the fingers of his organic hand as he allowed his gaze to fully sweep across the crowd for the first time. Even with mostly just core welders here, people of all shapes and sizes were present, reminding of how ridiculously diverse life in the galaxy truly was, even when you just had small sample sizes. Many of them were familiar to him by now, even if the first experiences he had with quite a few of them had not exactly been of the most positive kind. Despite the recent attack on their homeworld, a good number of Khoivari had still taken the time to be present for this event. The long necks of Koradilsh reached into the air to try and get a better look. Xanathis's purple plumage glimmered in the light as they ruffled their feathers upon spotting the human. More than one Cimmeraskis gave him quite the venomous glare, while enormous Limogasil bowed their heads down to inspect the tiny primates that were flooding the station in the hundreds. Arxur-Gerotarians' villainous skins flapped and wiggled gently, as they awkwardly pushed themselves up onto 4 of their 8 limbs, in order to look over the protective soldiers' heads, while Ecstasy impatiently scratched their hooves over the ground, causing their half-feathers to shake. Some other giants, as well as many of the smaller species that congregated closer to the living barrier itself, were ones that James only knew from brief glances in his memory cards, with the obvious exceptions of the Sippersling, who stood just a little smaller than the protective humans, many of whom jumped and bounced slightly in place, at attempts to get a clear look at the arriving party, while their trunks wriggled in anticipation. Apart from the humans, they also formed the only noticeable Deathworlder presence, and with his own sample size being rather small and very biased, James couldn't help but wonder what the general opinion on him was among the people of Tashard. For a second, his gaze locked with that of one of the original Deathworlders, wondering if he could glean any of their thoughts from the brief moment of eye contact. However, his attempt was quite quickly interrupted, as he felt the ground under his feet begin to vibrate in a rhythmic fashion as it again and again reverberated from heavy impacts descending down onto it. Before he had even fully turned his head, he could already hear some outcries from the 489th, loudly ordering someone to stop, as the sounds of boots getting into motion mingled with that of the surrounding crowd, large parts of which now audibly sucked in some air or gave some mumbled comment at what was unfolding before them. When James's gaze had finally caught up to the situation, it was just in time to see the massive tree trunk-like foot of a Zodiatos bull step down dangerously close to the human barrier, and the gaze of the head belonging to the same body as that foot was directed squarely at him, as the colossal proboscidoid shifted his muscle-bound body in preparation to take his next step. It is to be mentioned that the step was dangerously close for the Zodiatos, and not for the humans trying to block his way, who would be more than capable to handily avoid the crushing appendage should the need arise. The bull, on the other hand, would likely not be quite so able to dodge the retaliating storm of bullets, should he actually overstep a line. Despite that very real danger to his life, it did not seem like the man had any intention of slowing down at the human soldier's behest, and so the crowd went silent for a moment, as flesh-rending weaponry was trained in the direction of the bull's massive round head, daring him to commit to the next step that he was so clearly about to take. "Hold your fire!" James loudly ordered after a sigh, causing the heads of many a soldier to slightly rise in surprise. "Let him through." There was a brief hesitation from the soldiers, though to his begrudging credit, the Zodiatos bull actually stopped at James's command as well, and not in surprise. Instead, it seemed like the permission to approach had suddenly given him the necessary patience to wait until he could do so unobstructed. "You heard the lieutenant!" A new, much firmer voice then chimed in, as Admiral Krieger reinforced James's orders. And as soon as she had spoken up, there was no hesitation left in the soldiers, as they quickly lowered their weapons and moved out of the way in a manner that would allow the enormous figure to simply walk right over them. Proving more graceful than was expected of him, the Colossus quite carefully moved his legs past the much smaller Deathworlders, clearly demonstrating that he did not intend to hurt any of them on accident, as he walked towards James. However, that by no means meant that there was anything friendly about his approach as he came closer, his form effortlessly dwarfing James many times over, and making even the larger ones among his company appear childlike in comparison.
"Saint Aldwyn,"
the bull finally greeted, once he finally stood a little too close for comfort. So close, in fact, that James was unsure if the man could even see him, with the way his eyes were positioned on his head. However, the way the Core Welder chose to address him was of a far bigger concern, and caused a brief tingle to run down his spine. Of course, he wasn't unaware that the saint title he had been branded with, by the Church of the Fell Saviour, had established itself as a sort of joking nickname for him in many parts of the galaxy, which had no concept of the larger context behind it, and simply found humour in ironically calling someone as controversial as he was a saint. However, with the way that this Adiatos almost spat out the word, it was quite clear to James that he used the title in a way that was much more conforming to its original intentions. James's organic fingers twitched for a moment, before lowering themselves onto the hilt of his blade, pushing it deeper into its sheath as they resisted on the rounded edge of the grip.
"Let me guess,"
he replied, and deliberately decided not to strain his neck by looking at the underside of the bull's face, instead speaking straight ahead, much like the Adiatos had to be, given their current position. "Nafmir Durofren?" The Adiatos made a single amused sound.
"I am Durofren, yes,"
he announced, with a typical confidence, much like James had experienced it from the other Nafmir, who had accompanied HFY during their last meeting. "And are you here to find the same end as the two others?" James asked quite directly in return, "because you nearly did a moment ago."
"I do not fear you,"
the Adiatos announced, to which James immediately replied, "Bravery does not make you bulletproof." Nafmir Durofren scoffed in amusement.
"You would know,"
he announced, in a way that almost challenged James to give him a reaction, though he was likely aware that it wouldn't be quite so easy to get a rise out of the human. James simply sighed. "Did you have a point in your attempted suicide, or are you merely here to block my way for a couple of seconds?" He confronted the Colossus, not willing to entertain this back and forth, for no reason other than the sake of it. The man lowered his head slightly, causing the twin ends of his trunk to slowly sink in James's direction. Not long ago, the very thought of those things getting anywhere near him would have made him cower, but now he simply stood straight, and didn't even lift his gaze to watch them approach, simply daring the man to actually touch him without permission.
"I came to smell the blood on your hands,"
the bull explained in a much lower volume, though it couldn't exactly be called a whisper due to the difference in size. The brief hesitation before he said hands indicated that he was likely used to saying something else at that point, likely trunk or tusks or something of that sort. The ends of the split trunk stopped their descent far enough from James's head to not be considered threatening, even if it still felt more than weird to feel the brief, brushing wind that lifted some of James's hair up as they sucked in a deep breath. "Blood of those who wanted to spill mine," he said, as he briefly used his mechanical hand to somewhat fix his hair up again with a few quick sweeps, ending the motion by tucking his jacket into place. "Don't memorize it too well. There may still be more added to it."
"I have no doubts,"
the Adiatos replied, in an ominous tone of voice, as he puffed out a breath of air through the ends of his trunk, that fully disheveled James's hair as soon as he was done fixing it up. Annoyed, James rolled his eyes. What was this guy, 5?
"To answer your question,"
Nafmir Durofren then continued, as James just briefly brushed some displaced strands out of his face, opting to fully fix it once he had gotten rid of the irritating interruption, instead of wasting effort on it right now.
"I do not intend to follow in the path of those who came before me, Not at all.
Even though James hadn't gone through the effort of fixing his hair up that time, it seemed like the Nafmir was determined to try and provoke or at least irritate him. And so James soon felt another blow of air brush right over him, scrunching up his nose at the slightly stale smell of the Colossus's breath. For a moment, he wasted a thought on wondering if the core worlder was going to get out of his way if he declared the conversation to be over, or if it was going to be a whole thing to get him to back off. However, before he could resign himself to the course of action called finding out, there was suddenly a new sound that entered the mix of white noise and loud Zadiatos breathing. Not far off, a throat was loudly cleared, with a volume level that was very similar to that of the Colossus standing before him, and for the first time since the exchange had begun, James deigned himself to actually move his gaze in order to look over at the source of the sound that was so clearly meant to gain attention. A bit of a renewed smirk spread over James's lips, as his eyes fell upon the person that had so brazenly inserted themselves into the conversation. Meanwhile, Nafmir Duralfriend turned his gaze as well, and his trunk began to raise as he, too, spotted the intruder.
"If you wouldn't mind,"
Morgoth loudly spoke up, with a voice that was calm yet still boomed like thunder with every word, slowly stepping closer now that his presence had been acknowledged.
"The future councilman has quite a lot on his plate today, and several of his confederates are already eagerly awaiting his presence. If you have anything to discuss with him, there will be plenty of time for that during one of the public conferences."
The Liga Mordalar's curled-up tail briefly swept over the ground, before unfurling into its flattened shape and gently slamming onto the ground with a dull, slap-like sound, as the two absolute titans of the community were staring each other down. The Zadiatos still had a good 2 or maybe 3 meters of total height on the Class 5 Deathworlder, and the total volume of their bodies was stacked even further in his favor. However, despite the bulging muscles covering the proboscidoid's body bleeding through his thick skin all over, the Liga Mordalar still exuded an air of evolutionary power in comparison that could very likely be backed up if it had to be. The Nafmir's long tusks extended in the shepherd's direction as he turned his head to fully face him. Meanwhile, Mort's massive digging claws were flatly pressed against his chest like a covering plate of armor.
"Who are you?"
the Zadiatos bore last with an impatient tone that only left the very vague assumption that he was just a bit on edge from the sudden confrontation.
"Candidate Morgoth Strentane, Shepherd of the Strentane Caverns 8 through 17.
Morgoth dutifully introduced himself, each word rattling the heavy scales on his back from the firm reverberations of his thundering voice.
"Brother in name to the future councilman."
The Nafmir didn't quite seem to know which sort of remark to return to that announcement, which led to the two opponents briefly staring each other down with their postures simultaneously casual and threatening somehow. "I'm sorry for the delay," James said, suddenly interrupting the clash of the titans as the air had begun to get just a little too tense for his liking. The heads of both colossi twitched ever so slightly, indicating that they had been suddenly jerked out of an intense focus. "It's quite rude of me to make you wait any longer than necessary after making you come all the way out here." With that, James simply began to move again, walking right past these Zadiatos' thick legs as if they were mere trees growing by the wayside, and without much hesitation, his entire group followed along. Nafmir Duralfriend seemed just a little taken aback, as one after another, humans, Miat, Raphaelite, Tonashasite, Parasine, and Andalaya all simply ambled right past his leg without a care in the world, with Giranora even going the extra mile of making the very small detour that led her around his leg in a way that had her briefly pass under instead of besides his body, the hairs on the very tip of her tail ever so slightly brushing against his thick, wrinkly skin, before she caught up to the rest of her company. The Titan stared for a moment, as he clearly needed to catch up with the sudden change in scenario for a moment. However, he wasn't left to ponder for long. "Sir, please step back behind the line," a group of masked soldiers quickly ordered him, seeing as his conversation with James had clearly ended. James didn't pay attention to how the rest of that played out, figuring if he was going to get himself shot now, that was his own fault.
"I must say, quite the group you have assembled for us to greet here."
Morgoth commented, briefly turning his gaze to glance at the assembled representatives that were dutifully walking along with them. James smirked. I take it everyone else managed to get here as well? He supposed, with a sideways glance up at the giant.
We are still awaiting one guest of honor, Morgoth informed him with a nod. But he should be here soon enough. Luckily, you gave us plenty of heads up.
Glad to hear it, James said with a smile that was only slightly hampered by an intrusive thought. Sadly, there was one person who he would have loved to be around, who would be forced to be entirely absent from the event. But still, he couldn't let that stop him, and therefore he quickly shook his head before adding, I wouldn't want to do it without you.